I suppose the kitchen is where the truth lives in most houses. It's where secrets slip out between bites, where people think they can talk over the clinking of spoons and the hum of the refrigerator. But truth doesn't get lost in the noise. Truth has a way of finding its way to the ears it's meant for. I was sitting at the far end of my daughter-in-law's long oak table that morning, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, when I heard it. I wasn't meant to, I'm sure. "She's just too slow now," Rachel whispered, though her voice carried in that sharp way people's words do when they're trying not to be heard. "Too old," my grandson Seth added with a laugh that lodged in my ribs like a splinter. And then the one that burned deepest. "And too much work." Too much work. I didn't turn around. Didn't slam my mug down. Didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I kept my eyes on the rippled surface of my coffee, feeling my cheeks grow warm, my pulse settle into that slow, heavy beat that comes before a storm. I'd been living with them for 8 months. 8 long, humbling months since the fall that fractured my hip and forced me to leave the little farmhouse I'd tended for 47 years. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself family takes care of each other. But here, under their roof, I'd learned that help can come with invisible strings, and sometimes those strings are tied like a noose. Started small. Rachel sighing when she had to drive me to my doctor's appointment. Seth moving my knitting basket because it cluttered the living room. The subtle way my chair at the dinner table got pushed a little farther from the conversation each night. Kept quiet. I didn't want to be a burden. I swallowed my pride along with my soup and told myself to be grateful for a warm bed and a roof over my head. But too much work. That was something different. That was a judgment. A verdict passed down without trial. I stared out the kitchen window at the frost melting off the maple tree in their backyard, remembering the mornings at my own house. The sound of roosters, the smell of fresh bread cooling on the counter, the way sunlight used to fall across the worn wood floors like it had been painted there. My house had been my pride, my history. Now it was just another memory boxed away with the rest of my independence. I thought about the land. The 20 acres my late husband, Walter, and I had poured our sweat into. The land that had been in my family for 3 generations. When I'd left, I'd signed it over to my son, thinking it would mean something to him. Thinking it would be cared for. But I'd seen the way he looked at it. Not as soil and legacy, but as a property value waiting to be cashed in. Maybe that was the moment it began. The seed of the decision that would change everything. Maybe it started right there, in the stale smell of my cooling coffee, with their words hanging in the air like a draft you can't find the source of. I didn't say a thing that morning. I finished my coffee, rinsed my mug, and went back to my room, a converted office with a narrow bed and one dresser drawer I could call my own. And I sat. I let the words echo, not just from them but from years past. The nurse who'd told me after Walter died, "It's harder for women your age to start over." The neighbor who'd said, "At least you have family to take care of you." The cousin who'd offered me her basement apartment, "Until you find your footing," as if footing was something you could borrow from someone else. I realized then that my life had become a waiting room. Waiting for my health to worsen. Waiting for permission to live. Waiting for someone else to decide when my story was over. Well, that morning I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't ask for their approval. I wouldn't fight for their kindness. And I wouldn't spend the last stretch of my life apologizing for existing. But to do that I needed a plan. And plans take time, patience, and silence. So I started listening, really listening when they talked about me as though I wasn't in the room. I learned what mattered to them, what distracted them, what made them feel in control. And I learned how to disappear into the background, becoming the quiet, harmless old woman they thought I was. The thing about being underestimated is, it's a kind of freedom. They never see you coming. I kept my smile soft, my voice gentle. I nodded when Rachel complained about the cost of groceries. I laughed at Seth's jokes even when they cut close to the bone. I became their harmless shadow, until I wouldn't be anymore. That night, as I lay in the dark listening to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall, I thought about what it would take to truly free myself. Not just from their house, but from the small, careful life I'd been shoved into. And then it came to me, clear as the moonlight spilling across my bedspread. It would start with the land. The thing about land is, people assume it belongs to the person whose name is on the deed. But land remembers who worked it. It remembers the calloused hands, the bent backs, the hours spent pulling weeds and mending fences. That land still remembered me, even if my son, David, didn't. The morning after I heard those words, too slow, too old, too much work, I woke before anyone else. Old habits die hard. Even in their house, with no animals to feed and no bread to knead, my body still rose with the dawn. I made coffee, slow and quiet, and sat in the same spot at the table. The air was crisp through the open window, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves. Somewhere deep in me, I felt that familiar stubborn streak rise. David hadn't even thanked me when I signed the land over. He'd acted like it was his by birthright, not a gift. But I'd kept the original paperwork tucked away in my lockbox at the bank. Every survey, every tax statement, every receipt from the year's Walter, and I fought to keep it out of foreclosure during the drought. And there was one little thing I'd never told him. A clause Walter had insisted on adding back in '78. If the land ever stopped being farmed for more than 2 consecutive years, ownership reverted to me or my estate. David didn't farm. He leased out the fields to a neighbor for hay cutting the first summer. And after that, nothing. Weeds and saplings had taken over. I knew because I'd seen it from the road the last time they drove me past the old place. That clause meant the land was still mine. I didn't rush. No. You don't survive 76 years in this world without learning the value of patience. And if I'd learned anything from living under this roof, it was how to keep my cards close. For weeks, I played the role they expected of me. Harmless, quiet, the woman who needed help carrying a grocery bag. I let Rachel lecture me about portion sizes. I let Seth tease me about my flip phone from the dinosaur age. All the while, I was visiting the bank on the days Rachel was at her yoga class and Seth was at work, catching the senior shuttle like I was just going to the library. At the bank, I met with a woman named Ellen. She was my age, with steel gray hair and eyes that lit up when I told her the clause I remembered. She found the paperwork faster than I expected. When she slid that manila envelope across the desk, my hands trembled. Not from age, but from the thrill of it. "It's airtight," Ellen said. "You can reclaim it any time. Do you want me to put the process in motion?" "Not yet," I told her. "Timing matters. Because I wasn't going to just take the land back. I was going to use it." See, Rachel and David had been talking for months about expanding the house, building a fancy addition once the land sells. They'd counted on that money before it was even theirs. And I knew exactly how they'd react when they found out it never would be. While I waited for the right moment, I started reclaiming something else I'd lost, my dignity. It began in small, stubborn ways. I cooked my own breakfast instead of waiting for Rachel's bland oatmeal. I took walks alone around the block, even when they told me to be careful like I was a toddler. I went to the salon and had my hair done without asking for anyone's schedule. Every small act reminded me. I wasn't trapped. I was choosing how to bide my time. One afternoon, I overheard David on the phone in the den. "Yeah, we're just waiting for the old place to sell. That'll cover most of the Reno. Mom doesn't need it anymore. She's settled." Settled. That night I called Ellen. Start the paperwork. From that moment I moved in silence. The less they knew, the better. I arranged for a lawyer, an old friend of Walter's, to handle the transfer. I contacted a local auctioneer about selling the place, not to a developer or a cousin with a half-hearted promise, but to someone who would pay full price in cash. And while all this churned quietly beneath the surface, I sat at their table every night, nodding along to their plans for a sunroom they would never build. I thought I'd feel guilty. But guilt is for people who've been treated fairly and choose revenge anyway. This was survival. This was reclaiming what was already mine. 2 months later, Ellen called to say the sale was complete. The funds were in my account. A number so large it made me dizzy. Not because I'd never seen it before, but because it was mine alone. No co-signers. No joint anything. That night I made my move. I booked a meeting with a care service. Not the kind Rachel used to threaten me with when she wanted me to behave, but real, private in-home help I could trust. The kind that let me choose my schedule, my meals, my outings. I found a charming 2-bedroom condo in a retirement community with a pool, a library, and neighbors who actually smiled when they saw you. I signed the lease. Paid in full for a year. And then, I bought a ticket for something I'd always dreamed of but never dared. A month-long cruise through the Mediterranean. But I wasn't gone yet. No. There was still the matter of telling them, and I intended to do it in a way they'd never forget. I waited until the weekend when the whole family was home, lounging in the living room. Rachel was scrolling on her tablet, Seth was tapping on his phone, and David was watching a game. None of them looked up when I walked in. "I'll be moving out next week," I said. Rachel blinked. "What?" "I've hired help for myself. Found a new place. It's time I had my own space again." David frowned. "And the land sale?" "Oh," I said, smiling. "There won't be one. I sold it already." You could have heard a pin drop. Rachel's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Seth looked confused. David's face went red. "Sold it," he said. "Yes. It was never really yours, dear. There was a clause. I'm sure you didn't read it." I didn't stay to watch the full reaction. Had packing to do. But that night, as I zipped my suitcase and set my passport on top, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. They'd wanted me to be less. To shrink into whatever space they'd give me. Instead, I was expanding all the way across an ocean if I pleased. And when I stepped onto that cruise ship, I knew the real adventure was just beginning. I'd always imagined the day I left that house would feel like a jailbreak. But when it finally came, it was quieter than that. I was up before the sun, sipping coffee at the kitchen table while the rest of them slept, their lives still humming in the predictable rhythm they thought would never be interrupted. My suitcases, 2 of them sturdy and bright red so I could spot them anywhere, were already loaded into the back of the taxi I'd called. The care assistant I'd hired, Della, was meeting me at the condo later to help unpack. When the taxi driver asked, "Where to?" I didn't just give him the address of my new home. I handed him another slip of paper. "First the port," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "Going somewhere?" "Everywhere," I told him. The drive to the harbor felt like the shedding of a skin. Each mile between me and David's house loosened something in my chest. By the time the taxi rolled into the cruise terminal, I was breathing easier than I had in months. I'd chosen the cruise deliberately. Not the cheap kind that feels like a floating shopping mall, but a month-long Mediterranean journey with stops in Spain, Italy, Greece, and Turkey. I'd saved the brochure for weeks, looking at the glossy photos of turquoise waters and ancient cities, wondering if I was crazy for even thinking about it. But now, standing in line with my passport in hand, I realized crazy was staying in a house where you're made to feel like a burden when you've given everything you have. The ship was enormous, white and gleaming under the morning sun. Crew members in crisp uniforms greeted passengers with smiles that actually reached their eyes, something I hadn't seen in far too long. When I stepped onto the deck, the salty wind caught my hair and I closed my eyes, letting it whip around my face. This wasn't just a vacation. It was a declaration. I was here and I wasn't shrinking anymore. My cabin was small but lovely, with a balcony just big enough for a chair and a view of the endless blue. I set my things down, resisting the urge to unpack right away. Instead, I grabbed my sun hat and headed straight for the deck. It was there by the pool that I met Marco. He must have been in his 60s, with a voice like warm honey and the kind of old-fashioned manners you don't see much anymore. He asked where I was from, and when I told him, he grinned. "I can tell you're not here just to sit in your cabin and knit," he said. He was right. That first evening, the ship hosted a welcome dinner in the grand dining hall. I wore a teal dress I hadn't taken out of the closet in years, one that hugged my waist just enough to remind me I still had a shape under all that old woman camouflage Rachel preferred I wear. I sat at a table with Marco, a widowed schoolteacher named Claire, and a couple from New Orleans celebrating their anniversary. Conversation flowed easily, and for the first time in ages, I laughed without checking if someone was annoyed by it. After dessert, music started up in the lounge. I'd never been much of a dancer, but when Marco extended his hand, I took it. It had been decades since anyone had led me across a floor like that. My steps were rusty, but his patience made up for it. By the second song, my feet remembered. And by the third, I stopped caring about remembering at all. Somewhere around midnight, I caught my reflection in the lounge mirror, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. I didn't look like a woman too slow or too much work. I looked like myself. The days fell into a rhythm. Mornings in port, exploring cobblestone streets or wandering through bustling markets. Afternoons on deck with a book or a cool drink. Evenings of dinners, laughter and music. In Barcelona, I bought a silk scarf in shades of gold and crimson, letting it flutter behind me as I walked along the harbor. In Rome, I stood in the shadow of the Colosseum and thought about how even ruins can still be magnificent. In Santorini, I sat at a cafe overlooking the whitewashed houses and realized I wasn't thinking about what anyone back home might say about me. It was in Athens, though, that something shifted. I joined a small tour to see the Acropolis, and as I stood beneath those towering columns, I thought about all the women through history who had been told to stay silent, to stay still, to stay small. The weight of their stories pressed against mine. When I got back to the ship that evening, I went straight to my cabin and wrote in the small leather notebook I'd packed at the last minute. They thought they were keeping me in my place. Turns out, my place was somewhere they couldn't even imagine. On the 15th day of the cruise, we docked in Istanbul. I wandered the Grand Bazaar, dazzled by the colors and the noise. A young vendor tried to sell me a silver bracelet, and when I hesitated, he said, "For you, it will bring power." I smiled and bought it. But it wasn't until the final week of the cruise that word reached me about what was happening back home. Claire found me by the pool, holding her phone. "You might want to see this," she said. It was a post on social media, Rachel's account. She was venting something about ungrateful people and family land stolen. I read it twice, the corners of my mouth curling. She'd made it public, probably hoping for sympathy. Instead, the comments were split between people agreeing and others pointing out that maybe, just maybe, an older woman had the right to her own property. I didn't comment, didn't respond. I simply closed the app and ordered another iced tea. Because here was the truth. I didn't need them to understand. I didn't need them to approve. I was already gone. When the ship finally pulled back into port in the U.S., I felt the bittersweet tug of endings. But it wasn't the end, it was a beginning. My condo was waiting. My fridge already stocked thanks to Della. The pool sparkled under the afternoon sun, and my balcony had a view of the gardens. That first night home, I stood out there with a glass of wine, listening to the quiet hum of crickets. I'd thought the cruise would be the highlight, but I realized now that the real victory was this. I had built a life no one could take away from me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew David and Rachel would hear about it. Not from me, but from someone who'd seen me on that ship, laughing and dancing like a woman who had never been told she was too much work. I thought, after the cruise, that I'd heard the last of David and Rachel's voices. I'd pictured them sulking in that big farmhouse, the one that used to sit on my land, muttering to themselves about how selfish I'd been. But one thing you learn in a small town is that people can't stand a mystery. And my disappearance, my sale of the land, my sudden trip overseas, my brand new condo, had become a story the whole place was chewing on. It started with a knock on my door 2 weeks after I got back. When I opened it, there stood Helen Carter, a woman I'd known for years from church. She was holding a grocery bag in one hand, and a look in her eye that told me she wasn't just here for a neighborly visit. "Well, if it isn't the world traveler herself," she said, stepping inside before I could invite her. "I heard you were spotted in Rome." I poured her a cup of tea and tried to keep my voice light. "Word gets around." "Oh, it sure does," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she owned the place. "Rachel's been telling people she can't believe you'd sell the family land like that. Says it's been in your family for generations. And you didn't even consult them." I stirred honey into her tea, slow and steady. "I didn't consult them," I said, "because it wasn't theirs to consult on." She gave me a long, appraising look, then leaned in. "Between you and me, I think she's embarrassed. People keep asking why they didn't go with you. Why they let you travel alone. And you know how it is. When folks can't answer, they make up reasons." I smiled faintly. "Let them." And I meant it. But Helen's visit was just the beginning. The next time I heard about it was in the produce aisle of the grocery store. I was picking out peaches when I heard someone whisper, "That's her." When I turned, 2 women I didn't recognize gave me tight, polite smiles before walking away quickly. By the time I got home, there was a voicemail waiting on my phone. It was from my old friend Myrtle, her voice full of delight. "Lydia, you won't believe this," she said, laughing so hard she could barely finish. "I was at the hair salon, and who walks in but Rachel herself. She starts telling anyone who'll listen that you've lost your mind. And you're being taken advantage of by strangers. And then, oh, you'll love this. Someone pulls up a picture on their phone of you in Santorini, standing with a group of people, holding up a glass of wine, looking happier than I've ever seen you. You should have seen Rachel's face. She didn't know whether to keep talking or just leave." Played that message twice. Not because I cared about Rachel's embarrassment, but because it felt good, really good, to know she couldn't control my story anymore. Few days later it escalated. I was sitting on my balcony one afternoon, sipping iced tea and reading when Della, my care assistant, came out holding her phone. "You're not gonna believe this," she said, scrolling. "David posted on Facebook. Says you've abandoned the family and chased some selfish dream. And people are, well, they're not exactly siding with him." I took her phone and read the comments. Some were the usual small-town judgment. Family comes first, and old folks can be stubborn. But others made me pause. She gave her whole life to those kids, and now she can't live it for herself. One woman wrote. Another said, "I saw her on that cruise. She looked amazing. Leave her alone." It was strange seeing strangers defend me. For so long, the narrative had been whatever my family decided it was. But now other voices were louder. And then came the moment I didn't see coming. It was a Saturday morning, sunny and breezy. I'd just come back from the farmer's market when I spotted a familiar figure walking up the path to my building. David. He looked different than I remembered. Older, tired. He carried himself like a man who'd been stewing over something for a long time. "Mom," he said when I opened the door. "We need to talk." I let him in, but I didn't offer him coffee. He glanced around at the condo. The bright, airy rooms, the vase of fresh flowers, the framed photo of me on the ship with Marco and Claire. "This is nice," he said, but his tone carried something sour. "I like it," I replied simply. He sat at the table, leaning forward. "People are talking. About you. About us. Do you have any idea what it's like for me to hear that my own mother sold the family land without a word? Do you have any idea," I said quietly, "what it's like for a mother to be told she's too slow and too much work in her own home?" He blinked. I didn't let him recover. "I gave you decades," I said. "Decades of my life, my work, my money. And when I needed kindness, you gave me contempt. So, I took what was mine and I built something for myself." He leaned back, shaking his head. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "No," I agreed. "It was supposed to be me fading into the background while you went on living without a thought for me. But I'm not doing that anymore." He looked at me for a long time, then finally said, "People are calling you selfish." I smiled, a slow, deliberate smile. "Good." When he left, I didn't feel shaken. I didn't feel guilty. Felt free. That night, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Somewhere out there, my name was still being passed around. In whispers, in Facebook posts, in gossip at the hair salon. Let them talk. Because for the first time in my life, I was living in a way worth talking about. The morning of the Harvest Festival. The air was sharp with the smell of cinnamon and crisp leaves. I hadn't planned on going this year. Too many memories, too many faces I'd rather not see. But something in me shifted when I thought about David and Rachel strutting around like they still owned the heart of this town. Well, this year I wasn't hiding. I wore a deep emerald dress, one that swished just above my ankles, with the pearl earrings Harold had given me on our 10th anniversary. My hair was set just so, thanks to Della fussing over it until I laughed and told her she'd missed her calling as a stylist. By the time we got to Main Street, the festival was in full swing. Booths lined the sidewalks, the smell of caramel apples wafted through the air, and fiddles played from the stage near the old courthouse. I could feel eyes on me as I walked, not the pitying eyes I used to get, but curious ones. Measuring ones. "Lydia!" Turned. It was Sharon Morris, the president of the Ladies' Guild. Her jaw slack for a moment before she recovered her composure. "Well, look at you. You're glowing." "Life will do that to you," I said and moved on. It didn't take long before I spotted them. David and Rachel were standing by the pumpkin display, chatting with a group of townsfolk. Rachel saw me first, her smile faltering just enough to notice before she pasted it back on. "Mom," David said, stepping forward. His voice was louder than it needed to be, the kind of tone that draws an audience. "I didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't," I said. "But then I thought, why not?" People were watching now. You could feel the air change. Rachel cleared her throat. "We've been telling everyone how adventurous you've been. Must be nice to just take off like that." "Nice," I said, my voice calm but carrying. "Yes, necessary. Even more so." I could see the crowd lean in, not physically, but in that subtle shift where you know they're hungry for whatever's coming next. "You know," I continued, "it's funny how people will tell you you're too old, too slow, and too much work when they think you have nowhere else to go. But the moment you take control of your life, suddenly they want to explain it away. David's face tightened. We never. You did, I cut in. And you made me believe it for a while. But here's the truth, and I'll say it where everyone can hear. I'm not too old. I'm not too slow. And I'm definitely not too much work. I'm just too much for people who can't stand to see me thrive without them. A low murmur went through the crowd. Rachel tried to laugh it off. Well, you certainly seem different. I am, I said. And I like it. I didn't wait for a reply. I turned and walked toward the stage, where the band was finishing a lively reel. The MC spotted me. I'd known him since he was a boy and grinned. Ladies and gentlemen, he said into the mic, we've got a special request. Our very own Lydia Hanlon, back from her travels, wants to show us a thing or two. The crowd clapped, and before I knew it, I was on that stage, the music swelling around me. My heart thudded in my chest, not from fear, but from the pure thrill of the moment. And then I danced. Not like a young woman, not trying to turn back the years, but like myself. Every sway and step an answer to all the times I'd been told to sit down, stay quiet, make room for someone else. By the time the music ended, the applause was loud and genuine. I glanced at the pumpkin display. David and Rachel were still standing there, but they weren't smirking anymore. They looked unsettled. But later, as the festival wound down, a little girl tugged at my sleeve. She couldn't have been more than 8. My grandma says you're brave, she whispered. I knelt so we were eye level. Your grandma's smart. When the sun dipped below the horizon, I left the festival with Della by my side, my heart light and my spirit steady. I knew the gossip would continue, maybe even grow, but it didn't matter. The story was mine now, and I intended to live it out loud. That night, I sat on my balcony again, watching the stars wink awake. Somewhere out there, my family was still figuring out how to fit the new me into the picture. They might never succeed. And that, I decided, was just fine. And that's how the woman they called too slow and too old became the one who proved she was just getting started. My family thought they could decide my ending for me, but I wrote my own chapter, and it was filled with laughter, music, and the sound of waves instead of whispers. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: you're never too old to take back your life. If my story made you smile, cry, or think twice about what's possible, tap that like button, share this with someone who needs a little courage today, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Until then, remember, life isn't over until you decide it is.